Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and I'm pleased to be with Mr. Joe Castle today, the author of the Ashland Tragedy. If you've been listening to the podcast, we've talked about it a little bit, and I'm so happy and honored for Joe to be here with us. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing fine. I'm glad to be here.
Well, the book is great. I want to praise it as much as I can. But let's talk about, first I want to ask you the question, what is your Kentucky connection? Born and raised here. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a native of Kentucky. I've been born and raised right here in Kentucky. Actually, I was born in Ashland, Kentucky. I learned how to walk and talk there. And then as an Army brat, I was shipped off to Hawaii for a few years. And after Dad's tour there, we came back to Kentucky, to Fort Knox. Lived in Elizabethtown, right outside of Fort Knox. Went to school there. And after Dad retired from the service and I graduated from high school, we came back to Eastern Kentucky and living here in Johnson County. Dad and all his family's from Johnson County, and Mom and all her family's from Ashland, Boyd County. And I ended up working in Ashland for a lot of years. And I've always had a lot of interest in history, especially local history. And I happened upon this story about 15 years ago, and I was captivated by it and compelled to write about it.
Well, I, for one, definitely appreciate you writing about the story and bringing it to light. That's one thing we want to do on the podcast, is try to find these historical events, stories that are often overlooked and washed right by, and bringing light to them. And I feel like your book's done an excellent job. It's a good read, easy to read. How did you even come about the story in the first place? How'd that happen?
Well, I was at the Boyd County Library in Ashland looking for some local history. Mm-hmm. And I found this book. I know you can see it, but this is a large paperback book about the history of Ashland, Kentucky. 1854 to 2004. It's got a lot of interesting articles in there about the founding of Ashland all the way through up until 2004, the 37 flood and things like that. And I found a little article in here about the Ashland Tragedy. I'd never heard of it before, but when I read it, I thought, this is incredible. And so I thought, there's got to be a lot more to this story than just what's in that little book there. So I started researching it and found out that I was right. There's a lot more to this story. And I was instantly captivated by it. And I thought, man, this has got to be a book. And not long after, I spent a lot of time in the library researching this, looking through microfilm and newspapers, diaries, anything I could get a hold of. And the good folks at the library handed me a little booklet by James Morgan Huff. Now, Mr. Huff was an Ashland newspaper editor at the time the Ashland Tragedy took place in 1881. And James Huff was there. He saw a lot of the events that took place, and he chronicled much of that in that little book. And he published it and titled it The Ashland Tragedy, The Axe and the Crowbar, The Silent Witnesses. And there was a lot of good information in there, eyewitness account, basically. And but I had already found a lot of information and facts that he had not put in his little book. So I thought, well, I'll just rewrite what he wrote and put it into a book. And I thought, after a little while, I thought, no, that's kind of silly. I'll just keep what he wrote and build on it from there.
Yeah.
And because a lot of what he had written, I couldn't write any better than what he did. Mm-hmm. He's a good writer. And besides the fact that he was there for many of the events that took place. And so that's what I attempted to do. What I didn't want to do was just throw down a bunch of facts and have it read like a phone book or something. I wanted to write it in story form, maintaining the truth throughout. And I think I was able to do that. And but yeah, Mr. Huff was a a great contributor. And though his little book was in the public domain for years, I thought it would be wise to credit him as a co-author of the book. And that's why his name appears on the cover as co-author.
Mm-hmm. Well, I must say, I agree with you a lot. Like a lot of times you will get a history book and it reads like a telephone book, and it's just this, and this. And having that voice or that other element of a story being told is way better. And that's one thing with your book that I was, and me and you were conversing back and forth. I mentioned to you, hey, I've got this far and this is great. And then you said, well, have you got to this chapter yet? And I was like, no, I'm not got to that chapter yet. And you were like, well, wait to that chapter.
And one of the things Mr. Huff did when in his writing, he was objective, but he was writing it from the perspective of the Ashland people. Mm-hmm. And that's what I wanted to maintain. I wanted to maintain that perspective, but yet be as objective as possible. So.
Yeah. And so that book is in public domain, though, the one that he wrote, or the clips and stuff.
Yeah, it's hard to find. I don't even know if you can find it anymore.
Yeah.
And in fact, the copy I looked at from the library was incomplete.
Oh yeah.
And but I managed to find one. So I was fortunate there.
Yeah. Which that's a big thing when we're looking at history, and I say this often. Having that primary source that was there to kind of guide you on discovering the information you're wanting or the story you're wanting. If you can get a diary or something like that, that's great resource. But having a reporter there, throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, and let me say that his words make up about 30 to 35% of my book. Mm-hmm. So. Yeah. So
real quickly, for those who may be listening for the first time, give us the summary of what was the Ashland Tragedy.
Well, it was Christmas Eve, 1881 in Ashland. 3 bodies were pulled from a burning house in East Ashland. And it was soon discovered that the bodies they were young teenagers, and it was soon discovered that they had been murdered. So a quick search began for evidence, who the perpetrators were, and people were frantic. They weren't accustomed to crimes like this being perpetrated in their little town. And about 10 days later, a man came forward and confessed. He also named 2 other men who were with him the night that they committed the murders. The men went to trial in Boyd County, and they were all found guilty. The first 2 men were found guilty and sentenced to hang. The man who confessed was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. In the meantime, rumors were floating around about mob activity, lynchings, and things like that. So the judge over the case decided to appeal to the governor for help from the army to protect the prisoners, to keep them from being lynched. Well, it didn't work out exactly as one might hope, because the man who had confessed to the crimes was actually lynched. A mob broke into the jail, took him out of the jail, and lynched him there in Ashland. In the meantime, the other 2 men had appealed their convictions, and the Court of Appeals overturned them and granted them new trials. And when they had their new trials, of course, the 200-plus Army was there to protect them from any more mob activity. And the Army was positioned on a steamboat to take the prisoners down the river from Catlettsburg, which is the county seat of Boyd County, to Maysville. And on their way, they had to pass through Ashland. The river runs right by both Catlettsburg and Ashland. And they thought they were going to be met with a 2,000-man army that was armed to try to get the prisoners back from the army once they passed Ashland. There was no 2,000-man army, but there were a lot of innocent bystanders and onlookers on the riverbank as the boat went by. And what ended up happening was the army unloaded their guns on the innocent bystanders, killing several people and wounding a lot of others. And eventually, those two men were retried again. They were both found guilty again and legally hanged. And all this happened in about a span of about 3 years till it finally came to arrest.
Quite the event, I would say. The stress on the community of Ashland, just this kind of repeating incidents over and over again.
It was, and I've said before that the title of the book could actually have been The Ashland Tragedies.
Yeah.
Because one event kind of led into another, and it was a bad time.
Yeah.
And not only is this a story about a terrible crime, but it's also a story about the people of Ashland and Boyd County. Their resilience was really put to a test, and in a lot of ways, they didn't deserve that, but they managed to finally come through as justice finally prevailed. So.
And the I guess the outside pressure from the governor and from just the image, I guess, that was created about the people of Ashland is kind of another stereotypical kind of thing that rises up, that everybody's a hoodlum or out for vengeance.
They were kind of tagged or labeled as a mob rule town, unable to perform their own business, and there's a lot more information about it, a lot more details about it than what I just said.
I can
maybe answer some of those questions.
Yeah, we do have a few questions from listeners that we can go ahead and get into a little bit. But what was the final total on the bank? Do you know the exact number of how many people were killed on the bank?
Yeah, I think there were 5 people killed that day, 5 innocent people. None of the soldiers were killed, but there was several people that were wounded. Some a lot worse than others who would eventually die from their wounds. But the soldiers were just shooting wildly.
Unloading.
A couple of cows were killed. A horse was killed. It was a really chaotic scene. And this part of the book, I relied on Mr. Huff's account of it, and he really gave a nice description of what actually happened there.
Was he on the bank?
I'm not sure if he was on the bank. I know that he saw the murdered victims.
Yeah.
And he was, no doubt, he was present in the courtroom during the trials. But whether he was at the riverbank that day, I don't know.
Well, another question listeners have as well is how emotional was this to write? I mean, because there's a lot of rough stuff to write about, I guess, to say.
The confession of George Ellis was really graphic.
Yeah,
I mean, he told everything, and it was hard to read. And even when he was making his confession in front of there was a citizens committee that was basically in charge of hiring detectives and things like that. And some of those men couldn't stay in the same room while he was telling it.
Yeah.
And but it was, in fact, it took me about 12 years of research to get everything I thought I needed. And the family that was most affected by all this was the Gibbons family. John and Martha Gibbons, and 2 of their children were murdered. And by the time I got finished, I thought, or felt like I was part of the Gibbons family.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how it kind of works on you and kind of draws you in. And so yeah, there was, I mean, it was almost like I was obsessed by it, and it became a part of me for a while.
And now with John Gibbons, he was kind of accused at the beginning, and not to say he was this stand-up guy, but I mean, even taking that part out of it, his kids are killed, he's then accused, he then has to sit through these trials. I mean, talk about a roller coaster for that guy.
Yeah, his marriage with Martha had a lot of ups and downs, mostly downs, I think. and they had experienced a lot of bad times, not just in the relationship, but financially as well. And at this time, now John was 20 years older than Martha, and in 1881 he was 68 years old. But he'd formed a habit of leaving the home for periods of time, and so he wasn't even there when this happened. The detective that the committee decided to hire, he was from Ohio, and even though Ashland had a town marshal and a county sheriff, they weren't really equipped or experienced to investigate a crime like this. So they hired a professional man, and in no time at all, he decided that John Gibbons, the father of two of the murdered children, had actually returned to Ashland and committed the murders. And so he became basically the most hated and hunted man in America for a few days. And he was wrong, because Gibbons wasn't even in Kentucky during the time. But they really smeared that man's name pretty bad.
Yeah. Well, we think about oftentimes how people or media can smear somebody's name nowadays, but it's been happening the whole time.
It has. And the newspapers at the time were the media. I mean, that's where people got their, that was their outside connection to the world, And the newspapers held a lot of influence, and a lot of people were easily persuaded by newspaper articles and editorials and things. And newspapers were constantly calling for lynchings.
Yeah.
As soon as this thing happened, they were constantly saying lynchings will probably take place, and this and that and the other. And so they were trying to incite the people.
Yeah, well, you bring up two good points there with the newspaper kind of calling for lynchings, because in one sense, I think that kind of fuels the detective to kind of get somebody. We got to have somebody accused here to get to wrap this up. And then on the other hand, when George Ellis makes his confession, he specifically says, "Protect me from the mob."
He Alf Burnett was another detective who basically kind of fashioned himself as a clown in the whole story, but he was right about one thing. He did say that the people were clamoring for a conviction, for an arrest and conviction, and I think he was right about that. And John Norris, the detective that they hired, I think he felt that pressure as well. And of course, they wanted an arrest right away. I'm sure the committee didn't tell John Norris, take your time. You got all the time in the world. Nothing like that, I'm sure. And but I think he did act rather hastily in naming John Gibbons as the murderer, and he was wrong.
Yeah.
And it really, that was just another tragedy, because it basically destroyed that man.
Yeah.
I mean, and his marriage was already on the rocks.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that just, was the straw that broke their camel's back as far as their marriage or not. But, that was just one of the events in this whole dramatic saga.
Well, yeah. I mean, we can talk about Martha and the Thomas lady. I'm forgetting her name.
Caroline Thomas.
Yeah. Like those two, I'm sure it was traumatic for them as well, having to sit through court cases and trials, and I can't imagine.
No. Poor Miss Thomas, she was the neighbor lady, the mother of Emma Carrico from her first marriage. She was a widow that had remarried again. That's why Emma's sometimes known as Emma Carrico and other times known as Emma Thomas. But I can just see her at that burning house, knowing that Emma was in there, and then unable to get to her, and just screaming and hollering and crying, and you just imagine.
Yeah, it'd be terrifying.
And then having to face in court, having to face the men who did that to her.
Yeah. I remember reading. There was one of the questions was, when was this time the last time you saw your daughter? And I mean, I'm thinking like, wow, would you ask such a question? And
And poor Martha, she had lost her baby just a year before that. And he's buried right up there in the Ashland Cemetery along with the others. I don't know what killed him, whether it was an accident or sickness or something. But she had just basically come out of that grieving period, and now this, her two other kids, and the way they were killed, just terrible.
Yeah. Yep. Another question from listeners is it happened on Geiger Street, correct?
Well, it was part of Ashland called Geigersville or Geiger's Addition. You know how zoning will kind of stretch out the city limits of a town. In fact, they've done that so often now that Ashland and Catlettsburg both meet. There's no miles between them. At that time, there was about 5 miles between them. Little communities along the way. And but at the time, Geiger's Addition, it was also known as East Ashland. Was actually a part of Ashland at the time.
So where exactly is that place? Where exactly is that spot now? I guess is the question. What street? Is there even a marker, a historical marker, anything like that?
There's not, but there should be. The oral history tells us that it happened around 28th Street and Carter. Now, you're probably not familiar with Ashland enough to know, but the streets are numbered. From the south in Catlettsburg, where they meet, I think it starts at 50th Street, and the streets go down to, I guess, First Street, where Boyd County runs into Greenup County, and then the street next to the river, where a lot of people were gathered, was called Front Street, and it's still Front Street. The next street over is Greenup Avenue. Then there's Winchester Avenue. That's the main thoroughfare through town. Winchester is. The next street over is Carter Avenue. So Carter and 28th Street, it's right there, basically within the hub of Ashland. So it's close to the hospital.
Okay. I think it definitely does need a historical marker. So we'll have to figure out who to get in contact with to get that done. But a very compelling story. The other thing, kind of, the fire gets started, and there's not a fire. They have to do a bucket brigade. It was really, like you even said, a community effort from the beginning.
It's amazing how fast people showed up. Now, this was before daylight. The fire was, people were alerted before the sun had come up. It was still dark. And of course, Caroline Thomas was running and screaming, and the neighbors obviously heard that. So they came out to do whatever they could to put the fire out or save people, whatever needed to be done. And I'm sure people came running with buckets in their hands and blankets and anything they could to fight the fire. There was no fire department per se at the time. So they were fighting a losing battle, and they were fortunate, really, to be able to pull the bodies out before they actually burned completely beyond recognition.
Yeah, and it's more heroic efforts just by the people getting in there to pull them out. I can't remember the guy's name that did that, but it's still another showing of, I guess, just the grit of Ashland, I guess you could say, over the people. Well, you talked about the people coming and getting, or the mob coming and getting George Ellis out of the jail and lynching him. Those people were never identified, but there's a few rumors. What were some of the rumors of who those people could have been?
Well, they could have been Ashland people who were just had grown impatient over the court's activity. It could have been friends of Kraft and Neal, who may have thought that if they could get rid of Ellis, then they would have a better chance of getting off. Or it could have been a roving band of regulators at the time, which still operated in the area. There was actually an attempt by Judge Brown later on to investigate. And it was a weak attempt to investigate and bring to justice some of the people who were involved in that. Actually, there were a few indictments brought against some people, but nothing was ever pursued after that. So, yeah, it's hard to say who they were, really. It could have been a combination or a mixture of out-of-towners, people from across the river in Ohio, West Virginia, or Ashland people.
Yeah.
It's never been known and probably will never be known.
Yeah. So let's talk about Ellis Craft, because he was the kind of the ringleader of the whole thing. What was his connection though? He'd had a lot of trouble. He'd been in trouble before, but I just find it so compelling whenever he's at the gallows and he says, "My mom and dad raised me right," and raise your children right. I'm thinking, I don't know, the hypocrisy, I guess, of it all.
Doesn't seem like he would be the type of guy that would preach to you like that, but he took advantage of it. Every time he got in trouble like that, it was the same story. He would plead that he's just as innocent as a newborn baby, and he was just a bad character. He'd been in trouble. He had a bad reputation, and rightly so, because he'd been in trouble a lot. I think he was about 26 years old, and he obviously had a thing for young girls, because he had been, and this kind of sounds strange to me, but he had to leave the county for a year because of his relationship with some young unmarried women.
Yeah.
And so yeah, he was also like a silver-tongued devil. He liked to talk and basically talk his way out of just about any kind of trouble.
Yeah.
But he also threatened people. People were afraid of him. They were afraid of their life. They were afraid their houses might be burned if they spoke out against him. He was just a bad character.
Yeah. Well, and it just, I mean, whenever you're looking at the whole story and you're saying, were these guys really guilty? I side on the side of yes, they were. Mainly because I don't see that, there's no reason for George Ellis to just make it all up. Is that what's your conclusion on all that?
I don't think he made it up either, although I'm not sure he told everything. In fact, when this thing first broke, there were a lot of reporters and correspondents just came to Ashland, just camped there, and they wanted to talk to George Ellis. They wanted to hear his confession straight from him to see if there was anything else he had to say. And a lot of them thought there was more to it than what he was telling. Some thought maybe there was a fourth man involved. Some thought maybe George Ellis had played a larger role in what he actually said. And I didn't think about this till after the book was published, but that's a possibility, because maybe one of the reasons, or even the reason, that Kraft and Neal wanted him to come with them that night was to take care of Robbie Gibbons.
Yeah.
In case it created a problem for them. He was tried for the murder of Robbie Gibbons, George Ellis was.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very possible that he was holding the axe, and when Robbie tried to interfere with what they were doing, maybe they told him to take care of Robbie. Maybe he killed Robbie.
Yeah.
Maybe he didn't intend to, or I don't know. I'm just saying that's kind of a possibility. If there was something because now he knew that what he did was worthy of death.
Yeah.
When he made his confession, he said, "I'm ready to die. I deserve to die." And not to lessen the severity of what he said he did, but if all he did was help hold the girls while those other two accomplished their work, and then pour the oil, I don't know. I mean, if that's all he did, would he be ready to die for that?
Yeah, that's a good
maybe
point.
So. And maybe just witnessing it, maybe just seeing it all happen in front of him and knowing that he was part of that, maybe that was enough for him to think he needed to pay with death for that. I don't know. But I thought it was strange because I was asked not too long ago, why was he tried for the murder of Robbie Gibbons? And at the time I said, I'm not sure. But unless he did. Unless he did.
Yeah. And well, it's just, oh man, like you can only, I mean, I can't even imagine, like you said, I mean, if he, I kind of agree with you on that. If he was feeling more, there has to be something else possibly to the story if he was feeling that much guilt, but I mean, maybe just seeing it would be enough.
Yeah, it's really hard to say. It's just speculation at this point, really.
Yeah. And if, I mean, I know there's no evidence around there and there's no way we could find out, but like just knowing more about his relationship with Neil and Ellis Craft, knowing more about how their relationship together would make, their friendship, whatever it may have been, would help too, like as far as knowing his motives. I mean, was he just vengeful and wanted something to happen to Neil and Ellis, or that's the piece, I guess, that would be really enlightening, I guess, for the whole story. But we're not gonna get that.
Yeah, it's really difficult to imagine that even an insane person would have a hard time coming up with
fabricating that.
Yeah. Just because he was mad at Kraft and Neil, he would blame them for something they didn't do like that.
Mm-hmm.
And be willing to die for it at the same time.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And having so many things match up correctly. I mean, the axe, the crowbar, I mean, how's he going to know about that unless, he was there?
But, it's also really fascinating that both Neil and Kraft professed innocence right up till the time they dropped.
Yeah.
And now, I think the case against William Neal was even stronger than it was against Ellis Craft, because Neil immediately expressed concern about his safety after the murders, whether he'd be suspected of what happened, whether it'd be safe for him to live there anymore. And he kind of blabbed around a little bit too much, and all that was brought out in the trial on the witness stand. And so I think the case against him was a bit stronger than it was against Ellis Craft.
Mm-hmm. But Ellis Craft he brought the reputation as well.
He did.
Yeah. So, what was, I guess, what was your moment, I guess, when you were writing this whole process that you just, I guess, shocked you the most? I mean, there's a lot of things, but what was the one thing that you just like, whoa, I can't believe this?
Well, there were a couple things I discovered that I wasn't expecting. I don't think either one of them shocked me, but they surprised me. One thing was the citizens of Ashland, when they met after there was threats of mob violence, they met and appointed a resolutions committee and adopted a few resolutions. And one of the resolutions was, we pledge to protect the prisoners, to make sure they have a safe and fair trial and that no harm will come to them. Mm-hmm. And they had a lot of signatures attached to that. They took that to Judge Brown and said, listen, you call the Army off, you send the soldiers home, we'll take care of prisoners, we'll protect them, and won't cost you anything. And the judge refused. Mm-hmm. He wouldn't accept it. And so that delegation went back to the meeting, to the meeting, and told them what happened. So they sent another delegation to the judge and pleaded with him to accept their pledge to protect the prisoners. And he wouldn't have it. He told them no. And if he had accepted their pledge and they had protected the prisoners the way they promised they would, then the massacre at the river would never have happened.
Yeah.
And George Ellis may never have been lynched either. But it didn't work out that way. That was one thing. Another thing that surprised me was finding out how about the Army itself, the militia, the state militia. There's a lot of information there that kind of surprised me. Um, most of those men were really young and inexperienced, didn't have any experience, military experience at all, and that was admitted by their commanding officer, Major Allen. He said he had 200 inexperienced marksmen, and there on the riverbank, he said, so it's not surprising that a lot of the shots missed their mark and brought death into the crowd. And not only were they inexperienced, but they had no training either in arms. One of them had accidentally shot himself and ended up dying after they took him home. And that was just one. There may have been more. But that was another thing that kind of surprised me, because going in, I thought, hey, this is the Army, well organized, well disciplined, but no, it wasn't. Even the Adjutant General, Joseph Knuckles, said that the militia was in dire need of proper training.
Yeah, that is quite telling that they were that unprepared, or that, I guess, green, if I guess would be the green at of a militia that they had gathered. And it just is disheartening, because they were just firing into the crowd. Were they even aiming, like you said? Were they just firing randomly? And
and the coroner, the Boyd County coroner, held an inquest after that over the people that were killed there, and there were several witnesses brought forward. And I think the most telling witness testimony was that of Captain Kirker. He was the captain of the Granite State, the steamboat that carried the soldiers and the prisoners that did all the firing. And his testimony was really, really very telling of what actually happened. He was on the riverboat. He saw everything. And now the soldiers, a lot of them, no doubt, were scared. They were probably frightened. In fact, the whole thing there was instigated by a few men on the ferry boat that fired a pistol at the steamboat. So you can't really blame the soldiers for opening fire on the ferry boat. But one volley disabled the ferry boat, and that should have stopped all the shooting right there, but it didn't. They kept firing and kept firing. But Captain Kirker's testimony was what I consider key in the whole thing, because he said he saw no firing from the shore. In fact, all the testimonies of people that testified at that inquest all said there was nobody on the shore firing at the boat. But Kirker said that he tried to get the soldiers to stop firing because there were women and children on the riverbank, and they just continued to fire.
Yeah, to me that falls on Major, or was it Colonel Allen's, leadership, I guess. Just letting it go.
Well, he said he was unable to pass a ceasefire order around the boat, so he couldn't get it to stop.
Yeah. Well, that's another. It's a roller coaster ride. The whole thing. Do you know anything anything else that I got? Because the Gibbons has had another son, Sterling. Do you know anything? What became of them after all this? I mean,
I know Sterling. A lot of the good information can be found on Ancestry.com. When you're doing research. And Sterling Gibbons ended up going up north, I think, to Michigan for a while. But he died young. He was 28 or 29 years old. Yeah. I don't know how he died, but he's also buried up there at the Ashland Cemetery, along with Robert and Fanny and Harry.
What about Martha and them?
Martha, for a long time after that, lived with her daughter, Florence McDonald. Florence's husband, James McDonald, was shot 3 times by the soldiers on the riverbank.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Now, I don't think he died right away. I think he survived for a few years. And but he ended up dying, and Florence ended up as a widow. And
Wow.
and I think Martha lived with her for maybe the rest of her life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about John? Anything? Not much.
I wasn't able to find out anything about him after that. It's funny. I ended up just randomly in a chat with a lady a few weeks ago, and I sent you that picture
Yeah.
of John Gibbons. She actually had that photograph, and she said that was the only one she had, but she said that was Grandpa Gibbons.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was glad to get that. Looked like he may have been in his 50s or close to 60 in that photograph. It's hard to tell. But what happened to him after this, I don't know. I know that Judge Brown barred him from the courtroom during the second trials because he heard a rumor that John Gibbons was going to come in there and shoot both Neil and Kraft in the open court. And whether that was a rumor or not, I don't know, but he wouldn't let Gibbons in the courtrooms.
Yeah. Well, I guess that some precautions are taken. But John Gibbons, he did have other kids. He'd been married before, I believe, too, right?
Well, that's the rumor.
Mm-hmm.
A rumor that he had a first wife who died mysteriously, and that he had a daughter by that marriage. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's factual. Maybe it's not.
Well, I'm trying, like you said, the one lady that sent you the picture. I'm trying to think of, who that would have been. That would have possibly been.
Now he had 3 older daughters.
Okay. Yeah.
He and Martha had 3 older daughters.
Okay, that's right. The one lived in Ironton.
At the time, they all lived across the river, and one of them, in fact. The lady I was chatting with was a great granddaughter of their second daughter, who was married to a man named Nist, John Nist, and he was also at the riverbank. He gave a testimony at the inquest, but he wasn't shot or anything. So. Yeah. But yeah, they had those 3 older daughters, and they actually had another son that was older than Robbie.
Yeah.
I couldn't find anything about him. His name was William. He would have been about 20 years old at the time.
Yeah.
And after I got the book finished, I met a couple of descendants of John and Martha Gibbons in Ashland. Mm-hmm. And I asked one of them about that. I said, what happened to William Gibbons? Because the 2 people I talked to were actually grandchildren of him.
Yeah.
And I asked him, so where was he at during all this time? And the man that I talked to said, I don't know, but I heard that he was with his father working. So he may have been with John Gibbons up in West Virginia, but there was never any mention of him in any of the newspaper articles or anything. Huh.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting.
He ended up having quite a few children, and there's still a lot of his
descendants. Okay.
In and around Ashland. So
yeah, that's pretty cool. So Joe, thank you for coming on the podcast and talking about the book a little more. I hope our listeners have enjoyed learning about it, and I hope they'll go get the book as well. But before you go, I wanted to ask you: you got any more writing plans on your table? Anything you're looking at?
Actually, I don't. I've got a few short stories that I've written that I might do something with at some point. I've had a couple other ideas tossed to me, but I really have to get something has to ring my bell to get me in the writing mode.
Something's really got to bite you that you want to go for. But you said, how long have you been writing the book?
Well, it took about 12 years of research off and on, mostly, well, not mostly off, but a lot of years. Of course, it wasn't full time, research. Yeah. It was mostly here and there. But when I finally got it finished the way I wanted it, there it was. So, yeah, it took a while. And
Well, I mean, if if you want to do it right, sometimes you definitely have to take your time, and especially when if you're not able to just I mean, if you're not able to research every day, researching can take so long. I've been in the library or on the computer looking for stuff, and time goes right by. It can be very time consuming.
and and there were some things I wanted to verify that I had a hard time verifying, that took a while, and other things I wanted to find out either that I could or couldn't find out. So it just kind of prolonged the whole thing, really.
Well, once again, thanks for coming on. I encourage everybody to go out and buy it. Where can you buy the book at? I know you have a Facebook page people can search, the Ashland Tragedy. That'll pop it up. But just tell everybody where you can get the book at.
Well, you can get it directly from the publisher. It's Arcaded Publishing, the History Press. Of course, you can get it at the ashlandtragedy.com, and you can get it from Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere. Basically, anywhere books are sold. It's everywhere. And if you're in Ashland, you can actually get it at the Visitor Center there in downtown Ashland.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, the Highlands Museum in Ashland also sells it in their gift shop.
Okay, well, that sounds great. Again, thanks for coming on. I hope everybody's enjoyed talking to you. If anybody has any questions, you can shoot me the questions, and hey, you can come back on the show again, and we'll talk about it more.
Will do. Thank you, James.
Well, thanks for coming on. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.